Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Introduction to Psychology. Here we are starting on chapter 0, which almost doesn't seem fair that there's a chapter 0 before we get to chapter 1, but we'll go ahead and get started. In this chapter, we're going to be kind of connecting what we learn to the 33 men who were trapped in a mine collapse in Chile. This happened in 2015. Although they were able to make their way to a safety shelter deep inside the mine, they found they had access to only 2 oxygen tanks, very few medical supplies, and enough food to sustain 10 miners for 2 days. So as you can imagine, there were many more miners and they were there for many more days. There are two videos that I've posted on Blackboard about these miners, so you should watch them and just be thinking about the way in which their story connects to psychology. As psychology is the study of people's feelings and thoughts and emotions, how do you think being trapped underground, particularly after watching these 2 videos, affected these men's emotion, thoughts, and behaviors? I can imagine, for me, it would be very, very problematic. And so you can see that their story is relevant to psychology in many ways in terms of their stress and health, which we'll be talking about, their motivation, how their personality affected how they were able to deal with the situation they were in. Social psychology, that's the psychology of being in a group. And so because they were in a group dynamics were important in their being able to go through this situation. How does this affect their memory? Are they left with any psychological disorders, perhaps anxiety, perhaps post-traumatic stress disorder? And then if so, how do we treat those disorders? So that whole situation is very relevant to what we'll be learning about in psychology. So defining psychology, which is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So behavior are things people do, right? Anything from children having temper tantrums, using drugs, running away from home. All of these are behaviors, anything that you do. And then the mental processes are things that you think about or things happening in your mind. So mental processes like understanding memory, feelings of depression, feelings of anxiety, those are all mental processes. So you can see when we are looking and studying psychology, some of the things we study, you can see. You can see a child having a temper tantrum, you can see somebody using drugs, but some of the things you want to study, you can't see. Things like, how does someone remember something? What's going on in their mind? Or how is someone experiencing feelings of depression? Again, those are things that are really happening inside the person. And so because this is the scientific study, we actually use the scientific method to describe, predict, and explain behavior and mental processes. And psychology is a very broad field. This is probably the first psychology class many of you have taken. And so psychologists can do many things. The thing you think about most is like clinical or counseling work. A psychologist who has a little office and you come in and talk to the psychologist about whatever issues you may be having. It's kind of the psychologist you would see on TV and movies. But that is not all that psychologists do. And when I was an undergraduate, I remember thinking, I want to be a psychologist because I want to be a clinical psychologist. I want to help people. I want to have an office and have people coming in and helping them with their difficulties. But psychologists also do a lot of lab-based research. So we'll talk a lot about different research studies. There are studies going on university and college campuses, in hospitals, studying all sorts of things. How people remember, how do they learn language, why do they use drugs, what kind of treatments are available for people struggling with alcoholism. studies on autism. There are studies all over. And actually, that is what I ended up doing for much of my career is research. And we'll talk about that as we go through. Actually, chapter 1 is learning about research and psychology. And as much as I remember thinking I would never like research, I'm a people person, I want to help people, I really ended up enjoying doing psychology research. What else do psychologists do? They assess children in school settings. There are school psychologists. So you work at a school if you're a school psychologist, and children, you help children by doing assessments. These are usually tests. If children are struggling in school and you see if they have any kind of learning disabilities or differences, and try to see what's happening so that you can optimize their performance in school. Psychologists study brain function in medical centers. So there are psychologists working in hospitals and working with MRI scans, so at CT scans, looking at different types of brain damage and how that affects patients who maybe have had some kind of brain damage, or doing neuropsychological testing. In fact, I am a neuropsychologist, so we do different types of tests like clinical pencil and paper tests, where we have people try to remember different things for a memory test, or we have them take a language test. And by doing these kinds of tests, we can kind of figure out what parts of the brain are working appropriately, what parts might not be working well, and work with physicians to try to, again, optimize the functioning of these people. Psychologists study crime and their perpetrators. You could be a forensic psychologist and work in that sort of a scenario. We study how humans interact with products and technology. This is a growing field as technology is growing. Online classes, for example, how does that work? Is it better for students, worse for students? How can we make it better? Social media, etc. Psychologists work with athletes to enhance performance. There are sports psychologists, and this is just a few. So there's lots of different aspects, or what we call subfields of psychology. Now, you certainly don't need to memorize this chart, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how many subfields there are, and this is just a few of them. So if you continue on with psychology, you can take some of these more specialized classes. Cross-cultural psychology is really interesting. Environmental psychology, between people, relationship between people and their environment. Health psychology, psychology of women. We already said sports psychology. And then you might even think of one day going on to graduate school where you really would specialize in one of these areas. So there are many, many subfields of psychology. And then where do psychologists work? All different places. So you can see higher education, and again, just the general idea here, higher education, so at colleges, 26%, hospitals, 23%, in the school districts, kindergarten through 12th grade, 19%, but we've got our independent practice, our clinicians, 10%, business or government, all other human services. So you can see how psychologists work in lots of places. And then in terms of those subfields, over half are in this clinical and counseling subfield. But we've got biology and experimental, developmental, school psychologists, industrial organizational psychology. That's really interesting. That's how to use psychology in the workplace. How do you make people work more productively? How do you set up the office? What's the best way to have people get along and be productive in the workplace? So you can see that it's a very diverse field. Education of a psychologist, depending on the career you're interested in, this requires different levels of education. Typically, if you want to work in the field of psychology, you'll at least need a master's degree. So that's after 4 years of college, and you can get a master's degree depending on the program in 1, 2, or 3 years. And some people might get a master's degree in marriage and family therapy. That allows you to have your own practice and be a therapist. You could get a master's in school psychology, which allows you to work in the schools. You could also decide to have a doctoral degree. This is a PhD. This is what I have. And so after your 4 years of college, you can go either first to a master's program and then to a doctoral program, or just straight to a doctoral program. That's what I did. And that takes about 5 to 7 years more of school. And you can get your PhD or your doctorate in different subfields of psychology, like clinical psychology, experimental psychology, even school psychology. Do know that a psychiatrist is different than a psychologist. A psychiatrist is a medical degree. So a psychiatrist goes to medical school and then specializes in psychiatry. And this allows them to prescribe medication because they're medical doctors. One real interesting kind of controversial topic is the idea of prescriptive authority for psychologists. So this is the idea that if you're a psychologist who has gone through the PhD program and gotten your 5 years of psychology training, then you could perhaps choose for 2 more years of postdoctoral training, so after your PhD, in clinical pharmacology, which is medication. And after doing that, a psychologist would be able to prescribe medications. And when we get to treatments, but some of you probably know, many psychological disorders have the potential to be treated with medication, like antidepressant medications for depression or anti-anxiety medication for anxiety disorders. And so the question is, do you think that's a good idea? Do you think it's a good idea to allow psychologists to have prescription privileges? Now, typically, if a patient is needing medication, they need to go to 2 different doctors. They need to go to a psychiatrist for medication, and then a psychologist to do the talking and the talk therapy. And so that can be, number one, hard to coordinate. You need 2 appointments, right? Instead of just 1. You have to fit that into your very busy schedule. Could be more expensive. So the idea of giving a psychologist the ability to prescribe medication, well, then the patient only needs to go to 1 appointment where they would do their talk therapy and get their medication. Plus, this is perhaps helpful for more rural, underserved communities where there are not a psychologist and a psychiatrist on every block, basically. Someone may live in a town where there's no psychiatrist for hundreds of miles. And so every time they need to go get their medication refilled or see if they need medication, it's a big, long trek. And so giving a psychologist prescriptive authority may make mental health care more accessible. Of course, there's the flip side is, would you want someone prescribing medication for you who isn't a doctor? Because these medications interact, although typically they're very safe, they interact with every other part of your body and other medications you're taking. So as a psychologist, the training is not about your body and your body systems and all of that, whereas doctors understand all of that physiology. So it's a controversy. There are some states and some instances where psychologists have prescriptive authority, but it's not the norm, and people are still thinking about it. So interesting thought. Some students come into Psych 101 thinking, isn't psychology just common sense? Can't I skip the lectures? Can't I skip reading the textbook? I know this. And the truth is, it's not just common sense. For example, one of the myths that maybe people think about is that if you can just blow off some steam, express your anger, it's good for you. Get it out. Don't hold your anger in, but get it out, and then you'll feel better. Well, research actually shows that when you unleash your anger, it actually makes you more aggressive. It's kind of the opposite of what we think. And so if you decide not to read your textbook or not to listen to lectures, the things that sort of make sense, common sense, may not actually be what the research shows, right? Another one that as people get older, they start to be more sad, they live very solitary lives. Again, and that's a myth. People actually, we find, become happier with age. Interesting, and opposite to what we think. You can read the rest of these in your textbook, but just please let this be a lesson to you to listen to my lectures, read the book. Don't just go with your gut feeling or what you think is common sense, because it's often not what we actually find in our psychology research. Going along with that, psychology may seem like common sense because of a couple of phenomenon. One is called the hindsight bias. The hindsight bias is the feeling of, oh, after someone gives you the answer, you can say, well, I knew it all along, because it all seems logical after you know the answer. And we all fall prey to the hindsight bias because we're constantly trying to explain events. So again, if I were to tell you, unleashing anger actually makes you more aggressive. It just builds up all, you're getting your body all worked up and you're yelling and screaming and, maybe, physically punching a pillow or something like that. Well, of course, then that continues kind of as a cycle in your body to make you more aggressive. You could say, oh, that makes sense. Of course, that's correct. Because that kind of does make sense once you're given the answer. But if I were to ask you that question beforehand, you might have given me the other answer that, oh, yeah, getting out your anger is probably good for you, and then you calm down. So we have this hindsight bias, which is once you know the answer, you go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Of course. So it all seems like common sense once you're reading about it. But that's because we're giving you the answers or what we find in the research. And then the other thing that makes psychology seem like common sense is the idea of anecdotal evidence or personal observation. And we do learn a lot from our own experience that helps us survive and adapt, but it can't take the place of scientific findings. So maybe based on your experience with your grandparents, and I'm going back down to this second topic here, you have very happy grandparents. And so you believe that people actually become happier with age because of your experience. So these research findings are consistent with your personal experience, but that's not always the case, right? You could imagine that there are other people who have very sad and lonely grandparents. And so they would believe that most older people are sad and lonely. And so we can't just use our own personal experience. We actually have to use the scientific method, which we will talk about in the next chapter. So the end result here is that you must read and study for this class. It is very important. Don't just rely on your own experience, your own anecdotal evidence, your own common sense. And as I said, psychology is a science, and we'll talk about the systematic approach to gathering knowledge through careful observation and experimentation. And we'll use the scientific method, which has to do with a peer-reviewed process, using citations or other people's research for evidence, replicating the research, coming up with hypotheses, statistical analyses, theories. This is all in chapter 1, and so we will discuss that later. As I said, we'll talk about all this later in class, but psychology actually is a science. It's not just how do you feel and what makes sense to you. We're going to talk about the real scientific basis for what we know about human behavior. Psychological literacy and critical thinking, very important in this class. Psychological literacy is the ethical application of psychological skills and knowledge. And then we're going to be using a lot of critical thinking, weighing pieces of evidence, considering the source, where did that evidence come from, the quality of the information before accepting that it's valid. So you're going to be synthesizing evidence, that means bringing pieces of evidence together, thinking beyond just simple definitions, you're going to think more deeply, focusing on concepts and applications, and being open-minded and skeptical at the same time. So this is a real thoughtful process as we begin to learn about the basics of psychology. For instance, this question of, do birds of a feather flock together or do opposites attract in terms of relationships? The question is, are similar people more successful in relationships, or opposites? Are people who are opposite more successful in relationships? And in terms of what a critical thinker does and what we're going to learn to do in this class is, and the question here is it true that opposites attract? Are people really drawn to romantic partners different from themselves? So you could simply say, well, my husband is very opposite to me, so it must be that opposites attract. But again, that's just a simple anecdotal kind of piece of evidence, and it's not what we need for a scientific evaluation. What we're going to do with a question like this is go through these processes. Be skeptical. Why should you believe this? Where is there any evidence? Think deeply. What does it mean by opposites attract? Do we mean people with different personalities, interest, ethnic backgrounds, educational level, socioeconomic status? Opposite is such a broad word. We're going to draw on any existing knowledge. Did you learn anything about interpersonal attraction from any classes you've taken or any books that you've read? You're going to ask questions. You're going to consider alternative explanations. Maybe the opposite is true. Maybe people are attracted to those who are similar to them. You're going to reflect on your own emotional reactions, because we all have them. I'm attracted to people who are different from me, but my experience doesn't constitute scientific evidence. We're going to tolerate uncertainty, that the rules of attraction may not be universal. They could fluctuate over a person's lifetime. And we're going to keep an open mind. So all of these things are important as we critically evaluate the different research ideas and topics that we'll cover in this class. And what we want to do is beware of pseudopsychology. Pseudopsychology is an approach to explaining and predicting behavior, but it is not supported by evidence. This is like numerology or astrology. You can tell that something is pseudopsychology because it tends to make these broad assertions that are very vague and can't be refuted. This is the idea of a fortune cookie being able to tell your fortune. And if you say, I really believe that this fortune cookie can tell my fortune, and it says, all of your hard work will soon pay off, well, that is pretty broad, pretty much applies to everyone, applies to me starting to teach this new class, it applies to you starting to take this new class. It applies to my 10-year-old who's starting dance classes. It applies to just about everyone. So you can say, wow, yeah, that fortune cookie really, really got me, really was able to tell me a lot about myself. Same with astrology. When you read oftentimes those, what's a Taurus? What's your day going to be like? And a Capricorn, well, oftentimes those are very broad, and so they can apply to almost anyone. These would be examples of pseudopsychology. Recurring topics in psychology, we're going to keep coming back to the idea of nature or nurture. This is the idea of how much of you and your thoughts and behaviors are due to your genes and your biology versus how much is due to the environment, how you were parented, the school you went to, things like that. So we're going to keep coming back to that question. We're going to talk about culture. How does culture shape behavior and mental processes? Gender, how much does gender impact behavior and mental processes? Positive psychology. Positive psychology is looking at the positive parts, basically, about being human beings, looking at people's strengths and optimal behaviors, how to make people the best they can be. And psychology in the workplace. How does psychology relate to workplace behaviors and environments, no matter what your work is? So if you are a swimming teacher, if you are an accountant, if you work in marketing, if you work at wherever, a coffee shop, what are the connections we can make between psychology and your work activities? Can psychology help you be a better student? Absolutely. Psychology research has taught us a lot about learning. In fact, my PhD dissertation was on learning and memory, so I've studied quite a bit about learning and memory. What do we know? There's something called a testing effect, that we remember material better after we've been tested on it. So we will have little tests. We will have tests. We will have little kind of open book quizzes. But those are meant to get you to understand the material, to have it really seep in. We learn and remember material better when we see how it applies to personal experience, world events, cultural phenomenon. And so we are going to be applying what we learn to our real life as well as to other stories. For example, these Chilean miners. I've got some questions for you about that. And active learning exercises increase our understanding and retention of material. And so you'll see you have small assignments that are either on our Launchpad online homework assignment or our Canvas class, which are actively making you think about the material, and that will help you remember this material. And let me tell you, psychology applies to your life in every aspect and as you go through your life. So even if you never want to take another psychology class, this is a requirement that you need, this information can be very important for you as you move through your life. So I'm hoping to make it meaningful so that it sticks with you. You can look at this in your textbook about how to study smart, different ways to study, surveying the material, meaning skim through it, question anything that arises that you're not sure about, read, take notes, then go over the material in your mind, recall it, reread the material, that's reviewing it, individualize the process, break down this reading into small sections, space your studying, build in breaks and study over time, not cramming it all into one short amount of time. Minimize distractions. Multitasking does not help you remember material. We all think we're great at multitasking, but research shows it does not help you. So focus on studying. Test yourself frequently, and you'll have lots of little opportunities for this in the class. Work together. Collaboration can be effective. You will be working in groups. So if you can not only do the group activities, but also maybe study together and of course online, that would be great. And then sleep. Sleep is really important. Just so you know that approximately 1.5 million students enroll in introductory psychology courses every year. Some will go on to pursue psychology, but most will explore other careers. And so we will discuss how psychology relates to different career areas. highlight skills needed to succeed in a competitive technology-driven world. And all of this strategic thinking, creative problem solving, leadership, communication, those are very desired skills amongst different careers, and this is really what psychology focuses on. So by taking this class, again, no matter what field you're interested in going into, this will help. So let's take a deep breath and get started. I'm really looking forward to a great semester with all of you.